The wind off the Ruhr tasted like coal and old ambition. Mira had been working in the lab for 11 hours when the alien walked through the door. She almost didn't notice. That was the trick of it. They looked enough like humans that the first few seconds you spent your mental budget on small things. The odd stillness of their fingers, the way they never blinked at the wrong moment, the slight over-precision of their footsteps, as if each one had been calculated rather than felt. Mira had learned to notice those things. That was the only reason she was still alive. She set down her torque wrench and looked at her hands. They were dirty. There was a grease stripe across her left knuckle that matched a line on the secondary coupling she'd been fighting with since morning. She didn't wipe them. You never showed a thing clean when something dangerous was watching. Frau Kowalski? The alien had chosen a young woman's shape. Mid-20s, brunette, a soft, apologetic smile. It used German with a faint accent she couldn't place. I was told to speak with Director Hauer. He's not here, Mira said. Ah, the smile didn't change. That was the thing. Human smiles flicker. They live, they die, they react. Might I wait? Suit yourself. She went back to the coupling, but she watched. They had come 18 months ago and announced themselves over every radio frequency on Earth simultaneously. No invasion fleet, no orbital bombardment, no demands of surrender. Just a signal, patient and clear as a tuning fork, and then ships descending over 12 major cities like slow-moving cathedrals. The Vethiri, that was the name they offered for themselves, in 100 languages, simultaneously, explained that they were here to observe. They were scholars of civilizations. They had cataloged 47 sentient species across 3 spiral arms. They meant no harm, which was, Mira had said to Benedict at the time, exactly what you'd say if you meant extraordinary harm. Benedict had laughed. Benedict laughed at almost everything she said. He was the director of the Sonnenlabor, the Sun Lab, as the younger technicians called it. And he had the easy warmth of a man who had spent 30 years believing the universe was fundamentally benign. He'd built the lab on that belief. A small team of engineers and physicists working in an old converted turbine hall outside Essen, trying to crack the thermal-magnetic cycle that would make solar energy viable at industrial scale without the land footprint that had sunk every previous attempt. The Sun Machine, they called it privately. Nothing glamorous about the work. Lots of coffee, lots of failed tolerances, lots of mornings like this one, where the secondary coupling refused to speak to the primary ring, and the whole elegant theory sat uselessly beautiful in the notebook, while the hardware sulked. Nobody paid them much attention. That was fine. Nobody paying attention meant nobody trying to stop them. Except, increasingly, the Vethiri. Mira had been the one to notice. Benedict remained cheerfully skeptical. The Vethiri were scholars, not predators. If they were watching the lab, it was out of curiosity, not strategy. Mira had spent the first decade of her career doing energy policy work in Warsaw and Berlin, which meant she had spent 10 years learning how powerful interests behaved when they sensed a technology that threatened their position. She recognized the pattern the way you recognize a tune you haven't heard in years, something in the gut, before the brain catches up. The Sun Machine worked. Not fully, not yet, but the proof of principle was there. At full scale, it would produce energy at a cost that would make oil, gas, and every existing grid structure on Earth economically obsolete within a generation. The Vethiri's primary trading currency in their relations with Earth's existing governments, all 11 of the major compact agreements signed in the first 6 months, was energy technology. Specifically, their cold fusion licensing arrangements with 7 nation-state energy consortia. Those arrangements were worth, by conservative estimate, the kind of number that made defense budgets look like rounding errors. The Sun Machine, if it worked, made every one of those arrangements worthless. So yes, Mira watched. The alien girl sat in the chair by the east wall and looked at the lab with the polite interest of a visitor at a museum. Her eyes moved in smooth arcs, too smooth. Human eyes saccade. They jump and skip. These moved like a camera panning. What brings you to see Benedict? Mira asked without looking up from the coupling. I'm the daughter of an old friend of his. Noemi. My mother knows him from university. He didn't mention expecting anyone. I didn't warn him. A small laugh. I was in the area. Impulse. Mira fit the secondary coupling back into its housing and began threading the locking bolt by feel. Her hands knew this now. She could do it blind. Where are you from, Noemi? Stuttgart, originally. You, Krakow. Then everywhere. She snugged the bolt down. You said you were in the area. What brings you to Essen? Work. What kind of work? There was a pause, not long. A human would have answered with the same beat. But Mira had spent 18 months sharpening her instinct for the Vethiri's tells, and the pause felt like a processor cycle. Like something being looked up rather than remembered. Cultural liaison, the alien said, with one of the contact offices. Interesting work, Mira said. It keeps me busy. She put down the torque wrench and picked up her coffee cup. It was cold. She drank it anyway, standing by the workbench, and let her eyes track lazily across the lab the way a tired person's eyes do. But she was counting things. The alien's bag. The way it sat at her feet, not on her lap. The slight tension along the alien's left shoulder, like someone bracing for something. When Benedict came through the door 20 minutes later, Mira watched his face. He recognized Noemi. That was real, the way it broke across his features. A genuine surprise, a real warmth. He'd known her mother, clearly. Knew the girl herself, although it had been years. He ushered her to the coffee station and began talking enthusiastically about the sun machine in the way he always did when someone showed up who seemed willing to listen. Mira stepped outside to move her car. She did not move her car. She stood in the thin winter light between the turbine hall and the access road and looked at the gray Passat parked 40 meters down the service lane with its engine off and its windows reflecting sky. She stood very still, then she went back inside. Benedict was showing Noemi the primary ring assembly. Beautiful thing the size of a kitchen table, copper-wound superconducting coils in a configuration Mira herself had helped design. He was explaining the thermal cascade principle with his hands moving the way they always did, shaping invisible physics in the air. Noemi was asking questions, smart questions, the kind that took the shape of curiosity but were angled, Mira thought, towards specific information. Geometry, scale, power output estimates. She crossed the lab and picked up her phone from the workbench. She opened her messages to a thread labeled BK, old shorthand for Benedict Control, a running joke, and typed 2 characters, PA. Their code for Passat. They had codes because Mira had insisted on codes, and Benedict had thought the whole thing was funny and gone along with it the way he went along with most things he found charming in their absurdity. He glanced at his phone. His face didn't change. He kept talking, but he turned slightly so that his body was between Noemi and the notebook on the secondary bench. Mira walked toward the door as if heading to the washroom. She veered at the last moment toward the gear lockers. She opened her locker and took out her jacket, and, from the jacket's inner pocket, the signal disruptor that had cost her 4 months' discretionary budget and was about the size of a thick pen. She thumbed it on. The indicator light went red, then amber. Then she walked back through the lab. She came up behind Noemi as Benedict was speaking, and she said very quietly, "Take your jacket off, please." Benedict stopped talking. Noemi turned. The smile was still there. "Perfect. Excuse me, your jacket. Off, please." Benedict began. "Benedict, the Passat." He went quiet. The alien looked at Mira for a moment, those smooth eyes. Then she made a decision. Mira could see it happen. The subtle recalibration, the shift in posture, and the smile went from soft to fixed, and she said, "I'm just going to get my phone. It's in my pocket." "I know," Mira said. "Take the jacket off." "This is absurd," Noemi said. "Probably," Mira agreed. "Take it off anyway." The alien stood. For a moment, Mira thought it was going to refuse, and she tensed, running options, because she was not armed and the alien almost certainly was, and the signal disruptor was a bluff. It didn't actually disrupt anything. It had never worked properly. She had 3 pages of technical notes about why it had never worked properly and had simply never gotten around to replacing it. But she kept her face calm. She'd learned that from a KGB defector she'd interviewed once for a policy paper in 2019. The man had told her that in a confrontation, the first person to show uncertainty had already lost. The alien took off its jacket. The transmitter was sewn into the lining at the collar. A flat disc the diameter of a euro coin with a hairline antenna running down the seam. When Mira touched it, the alien flinched. Not a human flinch, which comes from the gut. This was a whole-body microtremor, like a vibration. "Who's in the Passat?" Mira asked. "I don't know what you're talking about," Noemi said. Benedict walked to the window. He looked out at the service lane for a long time. When he turned back, his face had something in it that Mira hadn't seen there in 18 months of working alongside him. Not fear exactly, but the face of a man who has just discovered that the thing he refused to believe in is real. "2 of them," he said. "Armed? I can't tell." He paused. "Yes, probably." Mira looked at the transmitter in her hand. The Vethiri used organic computing substrates. She knew this from the technical briefings that the EU contact office had circulated, mostly to warn people not to try to interface with their technology. The transmitter would have been broadcasting continuously. The two in the Passat had heard everything, including Mira's challenge. They knew they were burned. She had perhaps 30 seconds. The thing about the secondary coupling that had refused to cooperate all morning was that when you finally got it set right, the primary ring's thermal output jumped by 60%. That was the proof of principle they'd been chasing. What it also meant was that the electromagnetic noise floor in the lab quadrupled, and anything broadcasting on the standard Vethiri carrier frequencies, which used a band that civilian humans weren't supposed to know about, but which Mira had reverse engineered from 3 separate leaked contact office documents, got swamped. She'd seated the coupling correctly this morning. She'd done it deliberately. She walked to the primary ring assembly, and she flipped the main power switch. The sun machine hummed. It was a low sound, below the register of hearing, more felt in the chest than heard. The overhead fluorescence dimmed for a moment as the system drew. Then the ring began to glow, not brightly, just a faint, warm amber at the inner coil junctions, and the electromagnetic output rose, and whatever the transmitter in the alien's jacket had been broadcasting went nowhere in particular. The two in the Passat did not know that. The two in the Passat were listening to static and drawing conclusions. "We have maybe 2 minutes," Mira said, "before they decide to come in." Benedict was looking at the glowing ring. He had the expression of someone seeing a thing they built performing beyond their expectations at a moment of maximum stress, which Mira recognized because she had seen it on her own face in lab photographs, and had always looked slightly unhinged. "It's working," he said. "It's been working since 8 this morning," she said. "Focus." "Right." He straightened. "Right. What do we do?" The alien, Noemi, was standing very still near the coat hooks. It was watching Mira with an expression that was not quite the smooth social mask and not quite anything Mira could parse as human emotion. Assessment, maybe. Recalibration. Mira thought it might be the closest the Vethiri got to respect. "What are they going to do?" Mira asked it. "Your colleagues outside." "Silence. I understand your instruction set," Mira said. "I've spent a year and a half studying your operational patterns across 14 contact cities. Your primary directive in a compromised infiltration scenario is extraction without incident. Secondary directive is suppression of the compromising evidence." She held up the transmitter. "This is the compromising evidence. If I destroy it, and we all agree this conversation didn't happen, what are your colleagues going to do?" The alien looked at her. "They're going to come in anyway," it said. "Yes," Mira agreed. "That's what I thought." She put the transmitter down on the workbench. She picked up the torque wrench. Then she looked at Benedict and she said, "The secondary lab. The connecting tunnel. Go." "I'm not leaving you with Benedict." She said it the way she said it when she needed him to stop being warm and generous and start being practical. He had learned to hear the difference. "The secondary lab, the data backup array. Take her." She nodded at the alien. "Go," he went. He took the alien's arm. Gently, because that was how Benedict took people's arms, and led her toward the connecting tunnel at the back of the lab. Mira stood in the middle of the turbine hall and listened to the sun machine hum and waited. They came in through the main doors. 2 Vethiri in human shapes, male this time, both in the kind of nondescript clothing that shouted surveillance if you knew what to look for. They moved well. Too well, the same too smooth precision she'd seen in Noemi's footsteps. They fanned out inside the door the way trained operatives fanned out, covering angles. The one on the left had his hand inside his jacket. "Frau Kowalski," the one on the right said. Its German was flawless. Its eyes moved across the lab in that smooth camera pan, searching. "Where are your colleagues?" "Gun home," Mira said. "It's late. It's 3 in the afternoon. We start early." The alien on the right looked at the primary ring assembly. It was still humming, still throwing that faint amber glow. She watched its face process the information, the electromagnetic output, the apparent sophistication of the technology, the question of why a small, scrappy human team in an old Ruhr Valley turbine hall had built something that shouldn't have been buildable with available human materials science. She had been waiting for that moment, for them to see it. "The sun machine," the alien said. "We call it that," Mira confirmed. "Internally. We're not fancy people. You understand what this technology represents. In economic terms, yes. The numbers are actually pretty simple once you get past the engineering. I can explain them if you'd like." The alien on the left moved, not toward her, toward the ring assembly. She tracked it with her peripheral vision and let it go. "Let it look." "You've been watched for 8 months," the right one said. 7, Mira corrected. You started in late February. You were clumsy about the first car. Wrong plates for the district. She tilted her head. We noticed in March. I didn't tell Benedict until May, because I needed time to understand what you were doing before I had to explain it to him. The alien looked at her for a long time. She had the sense, not for the first time, dealing with the Vethiri, of being evaluated by something that could hold vastly more variables in consideration simultaneously than she could. Like being on the wrong end of a chess engine. But chess engines, she'd always thought, had one key weakness. They were very good at the game they knew and deeply confused by anyone who changed the rules. You cannot stop us from reporting this, the right alien said. I know, she said, but here's the thing. She pulled a small device from her back pocket, an ordinary-looking USB drive. Every proof of concept result, every design file, every materials specification is on this drive, and identical drives are in 8 other locations across 4 countries. Some of them are with journalists. Some of them are with physicists at 3 universities. Some of them are with politicians who have been looking for a reason to revisit the Energy Compact agreements for 18 months. She held it up. The information already exists in the world. What you're watching us do here, it's already out there. Suppressing us suppresses nothing. The alien on the left had been running its hands along the edge of the ring assembly. Its fingers stopped. This is fully operational, it said. The voice was different. Something underneath the words, some harmonic that the human voice modulator didn't quite filter. Genuine surprise, she thought, or the Vethiri equivalent. Since 8 this morning, Myra said. The secondary coupling was the last piece. Sat down right about the time your colleague walked through the door. The thermal cascade, the alien on the left began. Sustained, yes, indefinitely as far as we can tell. We'll run tests tomorrow. She paused. If we're still here tomorrow, the 2 aliens looked at each other. She couldn't read what passed between them. The Vethiri had communication modes that humans couldn't perceive. But she could read the pause. She'd gotten good at reading pauses. The one on the right said, You understand that the compact agreements represent a significant infrastructure investment for 7 nation-states, yes, Mira said. I've read all 11 agreements. The energy licensing provisions specifically, paragraphs 14 through 38, Annex C, Annex D. Also the confidential side letters which somebody at the Brussels office was kind enough to leave on an insufficiently secured server 2 months ago. She smiled. It was a real smile. She was genuinely, despite everything, in a good mood. The sun machine was running. The coupling was seated. The ring was glowing amber. I understand this creates a problem. A substantial one, the alien agreed. Yes, she nodded. But here's what I keep coming back to. You've cataloged 47 sentient species. Across 3 spiral arms. That's what you told us when you arrived. She took a step toward them. Neither one moved. What happened to the other 46? When you found their energy dependencies? When you found their compact agreements? Silence. Because I've been thinking about that, she said. For 18 months. Mostly at 2 in the morning, when the lab is quiet and the primary ring is cycling down, and I can hear the building settle. I've been thinking about what a civilization looks like after 18 months of the Vethiri's version of cultural liaison. She stopped 3 meters from the right alien, and I keep coming to the conclusion that what we need is not to hide the sun machine. We need to run it. The alien's head tilted. A demonstration, more than a demonstration. She glanced at the amber-glowing ring, a public record, continuous operation, documented, broadcast. You can't suppress what's already watched. She looked back at the alien. This is the moment where the 47th species does something different. This is the moment where we're inconveniently hard to catalog. The alien on the left made a sound. She wasn't sure if it was a word or not. The right one held up one hand, a gesture so human it startled her, and said, You've planned this for some time. Since March, she confirmed, when I spotted the wrong plates. Another silence. Longer. The sun machine hummed its low felt in the chest hum. If the information is already distributed, the right alien said slowly, then this facility serves primarily as a symbol, Mira said, and a working power source. We've run the numbers. At full scale, 1 sun machine unit covers an area of approximately 60,000 people. Modularly linked, you're looking at city-scale energy independence inside 4 years. She folded her arms. Without anyone's licensing agreements. The alien looked at her for a very long time. You are, it said finally, not what we expected. That's the idea, she said. The connecting tunnel door opened at the back of the lab. Benedict came through with Noemi a step behind him. He was reading something on his phone. He had the distracted look of a man who had been making calls while hiding in the secondary lab. "I've got the Spiegel," he said, "and Nature, and a DPA wire person. They're all about 20 minutes out." He looked up and saw the two new aliens. He stopped. Then he looked at Mira. "You were right," he said, "about all of it." "I usually am," she said. "It's exhausting." Benedict's face did what it did, the warmth unstoppable like light through bad curtains. He looked at the two Vethiri operatives standing in his turbine hall, and he said, in the tone of a man who had just found out that his paranoid colleagues' paranoid theories were fact and decided that this was actually rather wonderful, "Would anyone like coffee? It's terrible coffee, but there's a lot of it." One of the aliens looked at the other. Then it looked at Benedict. Then something moved in its face that Mira had never seen on a Vethiri. Not the smooth social mask, not the camera pan assessment. Something slower and stranger and harder to name. "Yes," it said. "Thank you." She watched that happen. She filed it. That was the thing about 47 catalogued species, she thought. After a while, you started to notice what you were looking for and stopped noticing what was actually there. You started expecting the pattern, the hierarchy, the dependency, the compact agreement, the managed decline of the indigenous energy infrastructure. You stopped being curious about outcomes you'd already mapped. The Vethiri had arrived on Earth with data from 46 previous encounters and a set of protocols built from that data, and a very sophisticated apparatus for making sure the 47th encounter went the same way the other 46 had gone. It was a sensible system. It worked. What it did not account for, what 46 prior civilizations had apparently not provided data on, was a species that broke its own tools on principle, that built things in converted turbine halls outside of Essen out of stubbornness and insufficient funding, that sent its energy policy analysts into physics labs to watch for wrong license plates, that left data on drives in 8 countries, and called journalists before the moment of confrontation rather than after, that handed the proof of principle moment to the person who had spent the previous year studying carrier frequencies and side letter annexes and the operational tells of compromised infiltration scenarios. That ran the Sun machine at 8 in the morning because the coupling had finally seated right and the moment felt correct, not because anyone had told them to. Benedict made the terrible coffee. He handed cups to both Vethiri operatives and to Noemi, and poured a cup for Mira and set it on the workbench near the primary ring, and the ring threw that amber light across everything in the lab, and outside the February light was going gray and thin over the Ruhr Valley, and the world was very quietly in the process of changing because 3 engineers and an ex-policy analyst had been too stubborn to stop. She picked up her coffee. It was, as Benedict had promised, terrible. She drank it. The journalists arrived in 17 minutes. The nature correspondent was first, a Belgian woman named Aerts, who moved through the lab in a controlled state of barely suppressed scientific excitement, touching nothing, looking at everything. She stopped in front of the primary ring and stood there for a full 30 seconds without speaking. "It's running," she said. "Yes," Mira said. "Continuously. Since 8 this morning." Aerts turned around. She looked at the 2 Vethiri operatives sitting near the east wall with cups of terrible coffee. She looked at Noemi, who had retreated to the far corner and sat with her jacket in her lap, with the careful stillness of someone who had run out of scenarios. She looked at Benedict, who was already explaining the thermal cascade principle to the Spiegel journalist, with his hands moving. She looked back at Mira. "I want to understand," she said, "what I'm looking at. You're looking at a proof of principle for distributed solar thermal energy at a cost curve that makes every existing grid structure on Earth economically non-viable within about 15 years, Mira said. And you're also looking at 2 representatives of an alien civilization who have had their compact energy agreements with 7 major governments rendered obsolete sometime this morning." She paused. The second part is relevant context for the first. Aerts stared at her. Then she pulled out her phone and began recording. The DPA wire journalist came in 10 minutes after, and the first thing he did was trip over a cable, which Mira grabbed before it yanked the secondary coupling out of its housing. And she had a brief, sharp moment of imagining 18 months of work bouncing off the concrete floor, which did not happen but kept her honest. The world was still made of cables and concrete and people who tripped. The physics didn't care about the moment. You had to care about the moment. You had to keep showing up and tightening the bolts. She set the cable aside and looked at the ring and thought, there it is. They'd run calculations, All of them, in the long evenings when the primary ring was offline and the lab was quiet. They'd sketched growth curves on whiteboards and argued about timelines and eaten bad pizza from the place 3 blocks over that stayed open late and would deliver to an industrial address without asking questions. 4 years of that. 4 years of believing the thing was possible and working toward it anyway, in the gaps between everything that said it wasn't, which was most things, which was almost everything. Nobody had been watching, except the Vethiri. And somehow the watching had mattered less than the building. By the time the February dark came fully down over the valley, the amber glow of the primary ring was the brightest thing in the lab. The journalists were still there. The 2 operatives were still there. Not detained, not gone. Somewhere in the middle, which was an unprecedented location for a compromised Vethiri infiltration scenario, which Mira took as a good sign. Noemi was still in the corner, but she had stopped sitting with that careful stillness and was watching the ring with the same expression as the nature correspondent. Something stripped of its professional surface. Something underneath that looked like plain wanting to understand. Benedict caught Mira's eye from across the lab. He raised his coffee cup. His 4th, she thought, or possibly 5th. He had the look he got when things were going in a direction that delighted and slightly overwhelmed him, which was to say he looked entirely like himself. She raised hers back. "Good morning," she said, even though it was past 7 in the evening. He grinned. Best one in a while. Outside, she knew, the feeds were already moving. The initial Nature post had gone up 40 minutes ago. Peer review would take longer, but the raw data was embedded, the operational proof documented, the timestamp on the ring's startup confirmed by Aerts's own recording. The Spiegel piece would run in the morning. The DPA wire had filed already, which meant by morning it was everywhere. The Vethiri compact offices in Brussels and Berlin would have seen the feeds by now. The 7 nation-state energy ministries would have alert systems for exactly this kind of headline. The licensing departments of the energy consortia would be in emergency sessions before midnight. None of that was Mira's problem tonight. Tonight her problem was making sure the primary ring stayed running, and that the secondary coupling stayed seated, and that nobody tripped over the cable again, and that they had enough coffee for however long this evening turned out to be. She looked at the right-hand Vethiri operative, the one who had spoken to her, who had said she was not what we expected. "If you want," she said, "I can explain how the thermal cascade actually works. The math is straightforward, mostly. It's the material's tolerance where it gets interesting." The alien looked at her. That slow, strange thing moved in its face again. "Yes," it said, "I would like that." She pulled a chair up next to the workbench. She found a piece of actual paper. There was a stack of it under the secondary coupling notes, and a marker. She uncapped the marker and wrote at the top of the page, "Heat, not fire." Then she looked at the alien, which was watching her, with the particular attention of something that had spent a long time looking for certain things and had just found something else. "Okay," she said, "start here." And she drew the diagram, and the ring hummed, and the February night came down full over the Ruhr Valley, and in 8 countries the drives sat in their hiding places, and in 3 universities physicists were opening email attachments with growing expressions, and on wire services in 40 languages, a story was already assembling itself word by word, and in a converted turbine hall outside of Essen, a woman who had started the day fixing a coupling explained physics to an alien by lamplight, while her colleague made terrible coffee, and the proof of principle glowed amber in the dark. That was how it started. Not with a fleet, not with a web, not with a speech, or a battle, or a treaty signed in a great hall in front of cameras. With a coupling that finally seated right, and a woman who had been watching long enough to know what to do when it did. That was the thing about humans that 46 prior civilizations had apparently failed to demonstrate clearly. They did not wait to be seen as remarkable. They went to work in the early dark. They fixed what was broken. They noticed the wrong license plates. They put the data on 8 drives before the confrontation. They ran the machine at 8 in the morning because the moment was right. They were stubbornly, exhaustingly, precisely themselves. And it turned out that in 3 spiral arms of a galaxy full of species who had looked at the Vethiri's compact agreements and signed them, that was quite enough. The sun machine ran through the night.